Welcome everyone to Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for UW Extension, Cooperative Extension, and on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, Wisconsin Public Television, Wisconsin Public Radio, Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance. Thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. And today is the anniversary of our 12th year of doing Wednesday Night at the Lab. Next week we start our 13th year. So thanks for coming out every Wednesday night. I appreciate it. Tonight I'm delighted to be able to introduce to you Mutlu Özdoğan. He's with the Forest and Wildlife Ecology Department. He was born in Tekirdağ, Turkey, and I am fluent in Turkish. And that's also where he went to high school. He went to Istanbul University, and he corrected me as I was writing down the word Istanbul. He said there's no N in Istanbul. Well, there's not two N's. And for my entire life, I've been pronouncing it Istanbul. This is what we call adult learning. That's where he got his undergraduate degree in earth science. Then he went to North Carolina State University to get his master's degree. Got his PhD in geography at Boston University. Then he postdoced at this little place you may have heard of called NASA. 10 years ago, 2007, he came here to UW-Madison. Tonight he gets to talk to us about mapping the world's croplands with this great view from up above. Not just a bird's eye view, but a satellite's view. Please join me in welcoming Mutlu Özdoğan to Wednesday Night at the Lab.
Well, thank you so much for coming. I really enjoyed these events. I think it's a great service that the university provides. This is my second Wednesday Night at the Lab event, and back then, in the first event I talked about looking at forests. Now I'm going to talk about looking at croplands. Before I start my presentation, I want to ask this question of why agriculture is important. And I'm sure people have different views about that, but these are some of my views over here. Obviously, agriculture provides food and nutrition. That's something, that's stuff that we eat. But many people around the world, agriculture is also a livelihood, right? There's a picture of someone trying to extract some sort of yield from the field so that they can sell that and then make money off of it. Increasingly, the agricultural areas are used for fuel, for growing biofuel products, and there's a lot of research, going on this campus. And I would also argue that agriculture has sort of this tradition, which is associated food and obviously economy. We're in the Midwest. Around here, agriculture is sort of plays a big role on the economy. And it turns out that all of those things are, in my view, interlinked. So if I put the cropland areas defined as sort of where crops are grown, variety of crops, all of these things that I just talked about are interlinked, right? So the food is related to cropland, industry, nutrition, climate, how sort of cropland areas regulates the climate that is sort of happening above that, and then water, obviously, population, economy. So there's a lot of sort of linkages that agriculture brings together. And not only that, but as our population grows and we reach somewhere around 9 or 10 billion people, we do have to grow more food. But believe it or not, Earth is running out of space in terms of growing food. We're actually busting at seams in terms of the best agricultural land, because we already found those agricultural land around the globe and we're cultivating them. And if you want to grow more food, we either have to increase the sort of per unit area yield, which we're working on, or we need to expand the agricultural areas, but the only places to expand are places like the Amazon forest, the sort of South American sort of pristine grasslands and so on and so forth. And not only that, but agriculture also has this sort of interesting balancing act. This is a slide that I stole from the World Resources Institute. So not only do we have to sort of increase the food and also help people sort of, you know, bring livelihood out of agriculture, but also we need to do that without wreaking havoc to this planet. Agriculture has sort of huge environmental footprint, whether that's removing the existing sort of natural areas to make way for agriculture, or to sort of intensive agriculture that uses a lot of inputs like pesticides and nutrient inputs that we see around here. So I stole these slides from a colleague of mine, John Foley, who was here in the past, and he talks about how sort of croplands are sort of prominent across the planet and covering roughly about 40% of the planet. And not only that, but to grow that much food, we also need to use a lot of water. So I'm trying to get this sort of get at this theme of, you know, agriculture is great. It provides all those services, but it also comes at a big cost. So there is sort of the nutrient cost and the water cost, and I'm sure everybody knows sort of this great story of the RLC, as you can see in the satellite. You know, in the last 30 years, how withdrawal of water from the RLC for irrigating agricultural areas has led to the diminishing of that area. So water agriculture is a big user of water, and you know, globally about 80% of global freshwater resources is used for agriculture. So the joke that I have with my students often is that those of them who take long showers, that's okay. You know, you're not the culprit, agriculture is with respect to water usage. Now, I think I've tried to sort of convince you that agriculture is important, and it also comes with some environmental footprint. Now, even though we know that, and that's a fact, we have sort of very little knowledge about agriculture at certain parts of the globe. Now, if you look at the Midwest or the US or Canada and perhaps Europe or Australia, we have very good knowledge of where agricultural is and what kind of crops are being grown and their sort of average yield value, so that we can sit down and do some sort of interesting analysis. But there are parts of the world where agricultural information is sorely lacking, and I would count Africa, India, and parts of Southeast Asia in there. So our knowledge of global croplands, I would argue, is regional, not sort of globally, sort of fully complete. The second argument I would make is that many of the sort of global agriculture data collection agencies like the United Nations and Food and Agricultural Organization depend on individual countries to report their agricultural areas. And those reports are often what I would call sort of subjective reports, because they don't necessarily depend on sort of any objective assessment. And the planet is changing really fast, so we're cultivating more cropland, we're changing the types of crops that we're growing in an existing cropland area, so changes happen really fast. And I would also argue that more and more environmental sort of impact analysis associated with agriculture require maps or data sets that are sort of spatially explicit and accurate and up to date that we don't have everywhere. And finally, sort of, you know, these data sets, sort of, if we can get at these data sets, that could help us sort of shape the future. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pose the second question of what is the role of remote sensing. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with remote sensing, the the textbook definition of remote sensing is acquisition of information about an object without physical context. Just the fact that you guys are watching this presentation and forming some opinions is actually a form of remote sensing. So with respect to satellite remote sensing, what we do is we build these sort of equipment. They're basically sort of souped up cameras, and we put them in satellite platforms and we launch them in space. And as they circle around the planet, they take a variety of pictures in a variety of different colors. And those colors include all the visible colors that we all can see, but also colors like the infrared, the short-wave infrared, long-wave infrared, and thermal infrared. And it turns out that many sort of vegetation studies that we conduct are sort of very sensitive to the colors that are built into those cameras. Now, there are lots of additional benefits of using satellite observations in the form of remote sensing. That is large area coverage, objective observations, because we're not relying on a person's opinion, but rather the opinion of light, a physical quantity. There are sort of, as I said, spectral capabilities that we can see beyond the visible color that human eye can see. And there is often wall-to-wall coverage. There's data anywhere within the planet, even the inaccessible places going back 40 years, so we can do historical analysis. And these data sets are very accurately located in terms of their geospatial location. So that allows us to sort of ability to acquire a lot of information in a very short time. Now, even though sort of remote sensing sort of has these sort of skills and has been around for a long time, and these are some of the sort of different agricultural examples that remote sensing can give you from different parts of the world, from the Midwest US to China to India at sort of different scales. Remote sensing has not been sort of very operationally used for agricultural assessment. And there are many reasons for that. You know, even though one of the very first Earth observation satellites were launched because of agriculture, people immediately realized that there were a lot of challenges as well. So some of those challenges are sort of mismatch between the needs and the deliverables. What I mean by that is if you go and talk with farmers, they want to see their own field every day with a certain wavelength. And it turns out that one of the early satellites that were built simply were not sort of capable of delivering that kind of information. Now, both the public and private sort of organizations are sort of addressing that issue, but that has been a challenge. And then satellites, however, have been designed for this sort of multi-purpose design. You know, engineers haven't built these satellites just to look at agriculture. They built the same satellites to look at forestry, to water, to urban areas, and etc. So there isn't sort of the ag-specific remote sensing tools or assets that are out there. And then we actually don't have the ability to look at every variable. So for example, if you ask me to tell you how much fertilizer a farmer puts on their field using satellite data, that's pretty much impossible. Maybe we'll get there in the near future, but we're not there right now. And there has been sort of traditional sort of cost and processing associated with this, especially with large volumes of data. Remote sensing has been around for a while, but there has been some challenges. But in the last 5 to 10 years, there also has been a lot of sort of opportunities coming our way, and I'm happy to report that because that's sort of job security for me. And some of these developments are related to computation, and some of it is related to changes in policies of how data are delivered. So for example, when I started using remote sensing 15, 17 years ago, you could only purchase a sort of single tile of image that over, let's say, Madison, and maybe at one time period, and you would have to pay $2,000 or $3,000 for that. And that's the only data you got. So the data volumes and prices were sort of somewhat they would inhibit the analysis. Nowadays, we can look at the entire planet, and we can look at download the entire archive of last 40 years of data, and then process that, but that requires additional sort of processing. So some of the sort of opportunities that I've been seeing and that I've been employing in my own lab are our ability to sort of process large volumes of data. The second part is there is this very sort of active and growing open source community. There has been sort of a lot of smart people, and I'm not one of them in terms of computer sciences, sort of have been developing these sort of really interesting tools that are directly applicable to satellite data. And then there's also a lot of sort of active community out there that is sort of providing science to open source community, and we're doing some of that at this university. Let me skip that. So these are some of the sort of data tools that I'm going to show you results of in a few minutes, but these are the kind of tools that we've been using. So what I want to do is, the title of this research, this talk is Observing Crops from Space. So what I want to do is, with that introduction, give you some examples of how we observe crops from space. And I'm going to do that in sort of 3 different contexts. The first one is, we're going to look at the entire globe and figure out where crops are, and we're going to try to do that at very sort of high spatial resolution, if you will. The second one is trying to map crop types at sort of specific crop types, corn, soybean, wheat, in large areas, and I'll show you examples of that. And the third one is, which is sort of more sort of dear to my heart, is trying to get at the crop yields at a field scale. So if you look at sort of Dane County, for example, and let's assume that there are 1,000 cornfields in Dane County, wouldn't it be nice to look at sort of estimate yields of every one of those fields and use that information in a variety of ways. So let me start with the first one. So about 4 years ago, we had a project funded by NASA, and NASA has a program called MEASURES, and MEASURES, NASA loves acronyms, and MEASURE is also an acronym. And the idea of a MEASURES program is that they wanted to fund researchers that would utilize satellite data, mostly NASA data, and other forms of data to provide products or produce products, map products for societal good. So we submitted a proposal and we got a proposal accepted, and the idea of that proposal was to map global croplands at different sort of scales and regions at 30-meter spatial resolution. And those of you who are not metric, 30 meters would be about 30 yards. So each pixel would see little less than a sort of a tenth of an acre. So imagine dividing the entire Earth into less than tenth of an acre plots, and then trying to map whether there is an agriculture or not agriculture in that particular plot for the entire global landmass. We call that product GFSAT 30, so Global Food Security Support Analysis Data at 30 meters, mouthful. And we've been sort of leveraging this idea of cloud computing because of just sort of sheer volume of data, and those data sets are being delivered right now as we speak. The whole goal of that project was to produce 4 map products. The very first product was to simply tell people whether a particular piece of land was cultivated or not cultivated. Sort of a binary mask, if you will. Now, once we derived that particular map, then the next idea was sort of driving this map of cropping intensity. Now, cropping intensity, not in this sense, simply means the number of cycles, growing cycles within a calendar year or within a growing season. Obviously, around here, our growing cycles are only one because we have a short growing season. We can only sort of fit in one crop sort of barely, if you will, around here. But there are places around the world where you can grow 2, 3, sometimes 4 crops. So this sort of second sort of product is looking at the number of vegetation cycles, number of growth cycles of agriculture in that particular parcel of land. The third one, which is probably more difficult product, is a crop type map in which we would tell you what is the sort of dominant crop type in that particular parcel of land that I've talked about. And I use the word dominant, that's because every year parcels change. So around here, if I was to create a label for a parcel of land, that label would look something like corn, soy dominated. And in North Dakota, it might be wheat, soy dominated. And in parts of India, it might be rice dominated agriculture because of their sort of changing nature of agriculture. And final product that we're interested in sort of deriving that we're delivering right now is this idea of irrigated versus non-irrigated. So it's taking a look at the same parcel of land and tell you whether that piece of land receives irrigation or not. And there are some abilities sort of in remote descent satellite data that would allow us to detect sort of whether that piece of land is being artificially irrigated or not. And the reason that's really important is because, as I said, globally 80% of freshwater resources are used for irrigation, and only about 18% of global agricultural area is irrigated, but the yields in those locations are really high. So for this presentation, I'm only going to show you examples of the very first product up there, and then some examples of the third product in a later part of the presentation. Now, the way that we approached this problem is we had a large team, and each of those team members had sort of geographic experience in different parts of the world. So a team took North America, another 2 team looked at South America. My team looked at Europe. I'm from Turkey, so I've been in that area quite often. So we know that area well. We took Turkey, Middle East, and Central Asia. And then other groups have looked at different parts of the world. And what we did is we used slightly different computing algorithms to drive the maps that I was telling you about, and simply sort of stitch them together to make a global map, and then delivered that to public resources that you and anybody else can download. The way that we approach this problem is by taking satellite data. So this is a mosaic of particular satellite data over Africa, shown in what we call a false color composite. And false color composite simply means any place you see a red color would be actively vegetated. That's why it's called false color. And this is actually a term that is sort of left over from the World War II. Then we could take those indices, data, and then turn them into vegetation indices. So in this case, the more green it is, the more actual vigorous green it is. But not only that, but we could also take additional variables like topography, slope, and etc., and then bring all of these into a computer machine learning algorithm in which you provide examples of what cropland looks like, and simply computer finds very similar examples for you. But instead of doing it for one pixel or one location, it does it for billions of locations in those sort of little parcels that I talked about. Now, I don't know if you can see it, but if you look at the middle part of that very left picture, you can actually begin to see little square boxes. I don't know if you can see that. And the reason you are able to see those is because those are the individual tiles of satellite image that is being collected with the satellites that we're using. So in this case, we had to take many of them, in this case, literally tens of thousands of them, and then sort of clean them for clouds and other issues and stitch them together to make these mosaics so that they can be used in a sort of an image classification algorithm. Now, the type of classification algorithms we use were what's called a supervised classification algorithm, in which an analyst like myself would have to provide examples of what a cropland looks like to a computer environment. And those are not that easy, especially when you consider a global agriculture, because global agriculture is highly variable. And how do you get the sample? So we reached out to global organizations like the FAO, the United Nations, and other organizations that helped us collect literally thousands of sort of on-the-ground examples of what agriculture looks like, so that we can take those examples and then feed them into a smart computer algorithm so that those algorithms could recognize what agriculture looks like. And obviously, that is really different across different parts of the world. In the Midwest, agriculture looks very different than what it looks like in China or in India, for example. So that was a sort of a great effort. I would say we spend half of our time just doing that instead of processing satellite data. So these are some examples. This is an example from Australia. Just within the continent of Australia, or country of Australia, there is a lot of variation, everything from rain-fed single crop wheat to rain-fed single crop lupin to canola and etc. And this is within a single landscape. And if you want to map agriculture in this landscape, you would have to sort of need to know all of these sort of different sort of character or characterization of agriculture. Similar things in Africa. So Africa was even a more difficult case, because in Africa there isn't a whole lot of commercial agriculture. There are parts of Africa that have commercial agriculture, like South Africa, Egypt, and northern part, and some in Kenya. But there are other parts of Africa where agriculture is just sort of a very transient and livelihood. And how do you collect sort of sample? So our team members from the UN and FAO has been sort of instrumental in getting to the field and collecting those samples for us. Now, once we took those samples and then ran them through computer algorithms along with our satellite data, this is the kind of map that we produce. So that you can go to that website and you can download and you can look at these. So I think it is also mobile able. But all the green, sort of these bright green areas show the places where global agriculture is. So what I want to do is, so this is the first product that I was talking about earlier. So what I want to do is I want to take a few places around this, this sort of global map and show you examples of detailed product. So here's an example from Bulgaria. So it's right there, for those of you who don't know where Bulgaria is, right there. So here is what a sort of global Google Earth image background would look like. Here are some mountains with dark forests. And then this is where the agriculture is, and our computer algorithm capture where agriculture is, and not capturing anything that is forest or urban or roads and etc. So that's one example from Bulgaria, sort of a temperate location, if you will. Here's an example from Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia 15, 20 years ago decided that because of the groundwater resources that they have, that they were going to grow a lot of wheat and then export that wheat. What a crazy idea. So this is one of their sort of big project areas. So all of those are large-scale irrigation projects, and sort of our product captures accurately those. And I would say that those are easy examples in Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And then here's an example in Vietnam, where here is the river. This is in the Mekong Delta area. Here's an urban area. There are some roads, and there is sort of a lot of rice cultivation between those areas. So you can do this yourself. You can go to it, to that particular website. You can look at it on a mobile phone or iPad or a computer. But those maps exist, and we're sort of very proud that we were able to produce products like these that are of service to a variety of organizations. Now, when I teach remote sensing, I tell my students to promise me two things, and those are: never take a map from someone without quantitatively assessing its accuracy, because anybody can make a map, right? Making an accurate map is important. And the second promise is never deliver a map without first assessing its accuracy and delivering that product with that accuracy number. So we spent a whole lot of time validating our map. And validation simply occurs by going to different places or extracting samples that are independent of the training samples, and simply trying to figure out how much of those samples that are on the landscape have been accurately mapped by the algorithm. So here is a sample data set. So we developed some sort of mobile tools to look at very high resolution imagery on a iPhone or on a sort of mobile device, and then simply put a dot in the middle of it to figure out whether this is agriculture or not. And we've done that over thousands of locations. And in some locations, we had access to other data sets. That's why there's this sort of important break over here. And then we compared the maps that we made against those. And I'm happy to report that on a global average, that particular map is about 90% accurate. Now, that's a global average number. There are places where the map is 99% accurate, and there are places where the map is only 60% accurate. That's just the nature of sort of agriculture and how it exists in that location, and how remotely sensed data may or may not be able to pick it up in that particular location. I can tell you that in the Midwestern United States around here, mapping agriculture is not that easy. And that's because we have large fields, so agriculture is really established, and you can really see in the remote sensing signal what is agriculture and what is not. But if you look at other places like China or India, parts of India, where within a place as big as this room, there's probably 5 different land cover types, including several trees, animals, humans, a couple of houses, agriculture becomes a really complex sort of variable to determine. In those areas, map fails to deliver at that sort of 90% accuracy. So these are sort of just examples of those apps that I've talked to you, told you about. Another way of doing validation is to compare our product to other products. So in the beginning of this talk, I mentioned that even though there are existing products out there, they're not always accurate, or they're not always capturing the type of agriculture that we're talking about. So this is a map that simply shows 3 different products. So here is a background image. This is in southeast part of Egyptian Delta. So here's agriculture, here's non-agriculture, and here's some agriculture over here. This is a global product that has been produced 10 years ago at 10-kilometer resolution. So that's a pretty coarse resolution data set. And here is a map that has been produced at 250-meter resolution. And here's a map that has been produced at 30-meter resolution. So as you can see, even though they're all showing agriculture, because of this sort of spatial resolution issues, you don't necessarily get the right area or the sort of right location. Now, the reason I'm showing this is because many of the sort of global, aid agencies, whether it's, USAID or World Bank or FAO, has been traditionally relying on maps that are made from those, because those were the only available products at scale that those organizations could use. And they were extremely excited to see the type of products that we're producing at sort of extremely fine detail. The second topic I want to cover is refining the maps that I described on a sort of more categorical level. So in addition to mapping a parcel of, as being whether either agriculture or not agriculture, the next level of information is, what is being grown in that particular parcel of land. Now that we know that it's agriculture, but what is it really cultivated with traditionally or dominantly? So I want to show you examples of that, and that's a slightly different problem. I would say it's a bigger problem. And the reason for that is twofold. One is, as the information that we require from satellites becomes more refined, like going from agriculture versus non-agriculture to what type of agriculture it is, the signal that exists in satellite data declines. That's because if I was to show you corn and soybean in a satellite image at a particular time of the year, you couldn't really separate them from each other, separate them apart or distinguish them from each other. That's because at that particular time instance, they are both green, and we don't necessarily see the leaves. As I showed you some of the sort of spatial resolution issues, you can't really separate them. So we need to have sort of these additional variables in our possession to be able to separate those crops. And it turns out that to be able to separate individual crops from each other, the temporal information becomes the most important piece of information. But that means that when you process the data, you have to access this sort of time series of data starting from the beginning of planting all the way to harvest for all the crops that you're interested in a particular land. So one example around here, for example, is separating corn from soybean. As you know, one of them is planted a couple of weeks earlier, and it grows slightly faster, and it peaks at a vegetation at this particular time. One is earlier than the other one, and that's senescence a bit earlier. So if you have a time series data that captures that small difference, couple of week difference, you would obviously separate corn from soybean. But what happens if a farmer decides to plant his or her crop 2 weeks later? Then in that case, they become somewhat indistinguishable, and those are the kind of issues that you would run into. So this is a different image processing or sort of satellite processing problem. And the idea over here is to convert these satellite observations. Here is an example of a sort of a true color composite where you can see individual fields into a map like this that shows where the individual crops are, and then simply separate them from each other. And as I indicated, the way that we do that is to assemble this time series of data. So we have observations that are roughly observed about a week apart. So anywhere on the planet, we can get an observation on a week apart. Now, when I say week apart, we get a sort of potential for observation today, and then another potential for observation about 7 or 8 days from today. Now, that doesn't mean the observation will be made. That's because Earth is a cloudy place. And especially around here in the summertime, you get a lot of clouds. So there might be times in Madison where you don't see the ground, at least with the type of satellite data that we use, for a month. So that means you have this sort of entire month of data gap in your observation. And what if that's the time of separation of corn from soybeans? So what we always try to do is we're always trying to find ways to fill these gaps, either by using additional data sets, which may have different characteristics themselves, or try to fill them with sort of additional sort of gap-filling methods that are more rooted in mathematics and computer sciences. But at the end of the day, our goal is to sort of build this time series and apply that. Now, a few minutes ago, I said sort of mapping crop types is a sort of a it has two problems. One is to just assembling the time series. The other problem is how do you get training and validation data? Now, I could give all of you a mobile app, and I would be sort of highly certain that all of you can tell me whether you're looking at an agricultural land or not agricultural land. But it becomes much more difficult to tell me if it's corn or soybean just by looking at the satellite data. So even though we had 100,000 samples for mapping crop, non-crop land, we only had 1,000 samples for knowing where crop types are in terms of a global sample. So there's sort of this multiple-fold decrease in both validation and training data that we could fit into feed into our algorithm. So I'm going to show you some examples from Dane County because we all know where Dane County is. So here's a product that we didn't generate, and I'm showing this just to sort of the example of what's possible out there. This is a product that has been generated by the US Department of Agriculture. And here is a crop type map for Madison and Dane County. And this is a crop type map for year 2015. And here is year 2016. And obviously, if you go back and forth, the last year's corn areas became soy, and last year's soy areas became corn. That's not always the case, but that's the most of the case around here. So the reason you're able to do things like that in a place like Dane County is because there are sort of known patterns that we can sort of extract data from and then map them. Now try doing that in Asia or in India or China, where there is no sort of specific rotation pattern or there's very little ground-related information. Anyway, that was 2015, 2016, and here's the 2017 data that just came out. Now, for certain places around the world, we had really good data, and because some of our partners were actually from India, and they were able to provide the ground data so that we can feed that ground data into our computer algorithms and map crop types. And not only crop types, but also whether they're irrigated or double crop or single crop type. So I'm just going to read some of these for you. So here is an irrigated, groundwater irrigated rice, maize, and chickpea color, wherever that color is right here, for example, that parcel of land has that kind of attribute. And obviously, in order to determine that sort of fine scale or fine categorical detail, you would have to know a whole lot of information about the ground. And without our Indian partners, this would have been impossible. So the message I'm trying to give over here is that we are able to make maps like these, but those maps will vary highly in their quality depending on how much ground data that we would have access to and how much sort of satellite signal or how easy it is in the satellite signal to define that particular crop type. So in India, we are able to do this. In Europe, we are able to do this. In China, unfortunately, we're not able to do this for a variety of reasons. If I was to show you that same map in a sort of more simple manner, you could also take that map and simply turn it into irrigated versus non-irrigated agriculture. And because India is the #2 global sort of irrigator in the world, and those are the places in India where you can see irrigated croplands in green and non-irrigated croplands in brown or red. So again, in places where you have this data, ground data, we are able to map them, but that's not always possible everywhere on the planet. We had examples from Bangladesh as well. So this is an example of different rice types from Bangladesh. And we had partners in Bangladesh that gave us great support. So one of the jokes that I have with people that I meet, and maybe I can do that with you, is that if you travel somewhere, tell us what kind of crops you're seeing. I'll give you my email at the end of this talk so that we can utilize that data to make a better map. Or if you know people in other countries. The last example I want to show you, which I'm really excited to share, is sort of this idea of yield assessment. And when I say yield assessment, I'm particularly talking about getting at actual crop yields on a field-by-field basis. As I indicated earlier, what if we had 1,000 corn or soybean fields in Dane County, and what if we were able to produce yield data for every one of them? Now, obviously, farmers who are farming that land know exactly what kind of yields they have. But that information is in private hands, and government would like to access it, or other organizations would like to access it for a variety of reasons, but it's simply not publicly available. What if we had the ability, or produced the ability to get at these idea of yield data? And the way that we have been approaching this problem, and I think we're somewhat successful, but it doesn't work everywhere, and I want to show you some of that. And the way that we approach this problem is we look at sort of satellite data. Here's a landscape with corn and soybean data, so different color refer to different crop type in the raw satellite data. And we can take that and turn into a crop type map. So green is soybean, yellow is corn. And then using the time series data that I showed you earlier, we can take the satellite data and turn it into a biophysical variable. And biophysical variable in this case is a variable called LAI or leaf area index, and it simply defines how much green leaf area a particular sort of plot of land would have. So if I was to go to a sort of highly vigor cornfield, for example, and simply cut all the leaves of the corn and lay them down in a 1 square meter area, and if I fill that 1 square area one time, leaf area index would be 1. And if I fill it with twice, leaf area index would be 2, so on and so forth. So with the time series data, we could convert these satellite observations into these biophysical variables that obviously have sort of biophysical meaning, and yield is a biophysical variable that we would have to get at. And we use a simple formula to do that, and that formula looks something like this. So yield is equal to some leaf area index times the amount of solar radiation. So you can think of these plants in basically as sort of solar panels. They have these leaves, they're absorbing all the radiation, and they're converting that solar radiation through photosynthesis into biomass. And at some point, that green biomass becomes grain yield, and then you can sort of allocate part of that photosynthesis into grain yield. And the beauty of this particular approach that was put forth 40 years ago is that it nicely lends itself to remote sensing, because one of these variables is actually sort of, this particular variable is the variable that we can get from remote sensing. So we take these satellite data for every pixel or every field in there. We assemble a time series, and then that time series variable becomes the biophysical variable. And then we can simply accumulate the amount of photosynthesis that the crop is going through, and then simply accumulate that, and through some simple conversion, turn that into a crop yield. So here's an example from Dane County. So this map is for corn planted fields. So every one of these little polygons is a cornfield, judged to be cornfield in the year 2003. So if you're a farmer and if your field is here, you can point to it, right? And this is the yield data that we produced for that particular year. So sorry, this is in metric. So 13 tons would be about 210 bushels per acre. Pretty good yields. So as you can see, there is a sort of wide variety of yields that you can get in a Dane County. Now, obviously, producing a map like that, as I said earlier, is easy. Anybody can produce that. But how good is it, right? It's an important question. So one of the ways that we can assess how good that map is to compare it to what the government USDA estimates are. So because we have the entire population of every field in Dane County, we can produce histograms. I love histograms, right? So we can produce a histogram, and that histogram would look something like that. It has an interesting shape, somewhat bell-shaped, but it's not exactly. And then on top of it, we could plot the USDA estimate for that year, which is this red bar over here. So what this particular analysis is telling me is that we are somewhat overestimating yields on the average value, but it's not that bad. So I think it's a good start. So one of the things that I'm really excited about doing is to expand this kind of technology to the entire Midwest. Imagine doing this for entire southern Wisconsin, where croplands are important, or Illinois or Iowa for that matter. and then produce that information, and then perhaps compare them to government estimates, and then somehow sort of use that information for a variety of ways, including environmental assessment, so on and so forth. So what I want to do is conclude by saying agriculture has great data needs. It's important, but it also has data needs. And I think remote sensing can address some of these needs, but not all of them. And it might be able to do some of these data needs really well in some locations, but not well in other locations. And there are challenges remain, but I think we're overcoming them because of sort of computation power that we have. And then there are a lot of sort of exciting developments that offer a number of solutions. And I think, you know, we're doing our part at this university to address some of those challenges. So here's my email address as I promised. So if you travel somewhere and see interesting crops, let us know what you're seeing, but we need to know where they are. With that, I'll thank you and take questions. Yes, sir.
Would you be able to go back to a previous slide? It was very much in the beginning, maybe about 5 or 6, and it showed, I think, 6 different patterns of satellite observations.
Right here.
Yes. Can you, what are we looking at?
So first of all, huh? Repeat the question. So, gentleman is asking what we're looking at over here. So, first of all, in these 6 images, the size of the lower end of the box is exactly the same. So this is, let's say, 3 miles, 3 miles, 3 miles. First thing to notice. The second thing is this is a true color composite. So it's made from visible colors that human eyes can see. What that means is anything green that you see in that image is agriculture or vegetation for that matter. And different patterns are different types of agriculture around the world.
Well, I can recognize, the circle irrigation easily enough.
Yep.
What is that pattern in the lower left?
So I don't actually, I think that's I want to say Africa, but I might be wrong. It might be Europe, but it's just that, so these are individual settlements, and this is forest right here, dark areas, and this is just so different, it's a pattern of expansion agriculture from that point source. It's just different way of cultivating the landscape. Remember, agriculture has a word culture in it. And I mean that with a pun because that's what agriculture does. I have a lot of colleagues who work in forestry, like they're looking at trees, and I argue with them that looking at trees are not that difficult, right? Because they're natural variables. Once you bring humans into the picture, it becomes more difficult. Does that help?
Yes, and now I understand. When you fly over Wisconsin and you fly over Germany, there's entirely different agricultural patterns to the land.
That's right. So here's a small story, since we have a few more minutes. So one of the very early reasons for Earth observation remote sensing to exist is because the United States government was very interested in knowing what Soviets were producing, whether they were going to have famine in terms of wheat yield, and whether there was going to be market in there. That was like 50, 60 years ago. And because they didn't have access to ground data over there, what they decided to do is they wanted to look at all the wheat fields in the United States, learn from that, and then the idea was, well, if wheat is growing in the US and it's growing this type, it must be growing similar ways in Russia, and they failed miserably. And that's partly because of the things that you just said. And these are clouds. And that's a cloud shadow. So when you try to clean the clouds, you got to get rid of the shadows as well. Yes?
Could you explain about how these sensing satellites work and the technology?
Sure. You can think of them as cameras, sort of souped up cameras, simply strapped to a orbiting platform like a satellite, and they're simply looking down. And as they're traveling around the planet at a certain speed, they're simply taking pictures in a sort of a continuous fashion.
And you said they could sense exactly how much of an area now they're the technology?
No, we interpret data to get at that information. What they give us is literally a picture, and then we apply computer processing algorithms to turn that raw data into information, some of which I shared with you. These are raw images. Yeah. And they're freely available. You can download them. I can give you an address. Yes, sir.
I'd like to know what classification algorithms you used.
In this case, it was decision trees, particularly random forest. Random forest.
And this is a huge amount of information, and information can be used for good or evil, I suppose. Are there issues about misuse of this kind of data?
At the scale that we're operating, I can't think of any because I get this question a lot. You know, like, can you see poppy fields in Afghanistan, or can you see other type of fields in Colombia? And it turns out that those are really difficult to detect with the technology that we're using. Now, it turns out that government may have access to other forms of technology, such as radar or hyperspectral sensing, that may be able to get at those. But with the type of information that we have, I don't see a whole lot of ways of using it in evil ways.
One of the questions I have is the mapping that they're doing here, is that done basically with overlay mapping, or is it increased resolution over a period of time?
I'm not sure.
Or do they use both within the algorithm?
The algorithm uses a single resolution data. So all 30-meter data assembled into time series over a 2-3 year period, and then fed into a classification algorithm with training samples that tells the computer, here is an agriculture, here is not an agriculture, go find another billion of those parcels.
And then the last question, does it take sustainability into account at all within the algorithm, or no?
No.
No.
No. They're actually pretty stupid algorithms, if you will. They're simply learning from the patterns that we're providing them. The reason we use them is because they're really fast. It would take us ages to get a billion parcels to label them. We would do a great job, but it would take us forever. So computers make it faster.
Can you use the same technology to assess animal agriculture as far as how many animals, like say beef production, pigs, chickens, and stuff like this?
So people have used similar data to look at pasture areas. Yeah. So instead of looking at parcel of land as agriculture or not agriculture, they labeled it as pasture or not pasture. And that's sort of as a proxy for the growing habitat or environment. But in terms of, like, if you're thinking about counting animals and things like that, this is not the kind of data that will lend itself. Now, I must say, there are private data vendors out there, some of which you may have heard. They can produce data up to like this spatial resolution, literally. You would have to pay for them, and they exist. But we don't have the resources to go, use those data sets for a variety of reasons.
Can I follow up on that with a question on rangelands? You said so important in the western part of the United States. You've got cropland, we've got pasture land, and rangeland.
So rangeland is not in our definition of agriculture, yeah. But you could easily take this method and then simply guide it for rangeland. You would have to provide examples of that.
You mentioned that in your attempts to determine what type of crop you're looking at when the crop comes to peak, but you also mentioned regions where there's 3 or 4 crops per year, which indicates a pretty even climate.
That's right.
Don't you then have the issue that Muhammad is going to plant his first crop here in February, and Abdul's going to plant the first crop, his neighbor, in March? And so doesn't it just mess up your time, completely skew your time?
Absolutely, it does. And those are the places we don't do that well. However, if we have access to ground information, sufficient ground information, we are able to detect certain patterns. And it turns out that even though what you say is exactly true, it is also true that farmers do follow certain patterns. So for example, in the Mekong Delta, they're growing 3 crops, 100-day rice. So they're able to provide 3 rice crops per season. But it turns out that each of those rice crops is planted roughly about the same time. They're harvested roughly about the same time. And then we are able to see those 3 peaks, each of which are associated with an individual rice cycle. It's not always easy everywhere like that, but there are, I think, certain patterns. But it really depends on how much ground information we have from that location.
Yeah, this is a different type of question you may not be able to answer, but I read an article like archaeologists are using some of these sensing devices to find out how big these old cities were. Have you heard anything like that? I don't know how it works.
I have heard of it, and most of it is, I would say, visual interpretation. I mean, that's how initially most satellite interpretation was made, because humans are the best image processors. You know, when you look at those patterns, you can tell right away what kind of patterns you're looking at, often. So most of those analyses are done visually because they're small areas, sort of concentrated areas.
Yeah, because they were doing it on the ground, and then they used this sensing device, and it was so much bigger than they ever figured.
That's right.
I can't remember what city.
And I think that's related to this concept of, you know, if you want to really know your landscape, you go up on a hill, and then you look down around that landscape, and you see much better. So you know, this kind of information gives you the landscape picture, because if you're around it, or if you're looking at buildings and old archaeological sites, it's hard to see the big context. And I think that's where the satellite data becomes really useful. But you have to have the ability to detect the object, so spatial resolution really matters.
Yeah, or if they're in a jungle, they come out and see where these old civilizations were. I don't know how.
That's right. So. One type of technology which is not in this presentation is an active remote sensing technology, in which you can build a sensor where you can generate your own energy source and bounce that energy source to the ground and receive it at the satellite and figure out how high your ground is. Very similar to your laser rangefinders. Imagine a very sophisticated laser rangefinder in space and bouncing lasers to the planet, and then simply getting at how high the planet is. So I've seen some studies where they were able to look at the height of the mounds and then distinguish that from natural areas. That's not the kind of information we're using over here.
I figured it may not have related to what you were talking about. Thank you.
How detailed is that when you're talking about satellites? Like, I'm familiar with LiDAR, which can be very detailed but expensive. When you're talking about doing that from space, could you like literally say like, oh, corn is 6 feet tall, soybeans are 3 feet tall? We could use that laser data to tell the difference? So the best, so there's no dedicated LiDAR in space. Right. So people are working on that technology. There are airborne LiDARs, and I've seen cases of sort of 0.5 meter sensitivity. Okay, so if like, how sensitive is it when it's not LiDAR, but it's lasers from space? LiDAR is laser from space. Okay. Yes. I'm only familiar with LiDAR from airplanes, I guess. Yep, that's laser from space. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. When you're talking about lasers from satellites, how sensitive is that? I think the satellites that they're building right now has the sensitivity of 0.5 meter to 1 meter. Okay, so like that could potentially be sensitive enough to tell the difference between soybeans and maybe, maybe. Interesting research area, but still in a very research domain. Yeah. So for example, we can do really well with trees. You know, get at tree heights, big trees, small trees, and get at biomass and things like that. I haven't seen a whole lot of research for agriculture. I have seen them from drones. You know, you can actually put a laser in a drone and figure out, because it's such a small footprint. So I've seen those, but when in space, I'm not sure. I'm not a LiDAR expert. Yeah.
According to climate or country or something else like that? And if you do, how much of an impact does that make? So in this case, they were stratified geographically. So remember in the very sort of middle slide I showed, you know, this area was one team, this area was one team. That was the geographic stratification. So training data in each of those geography were different in terms of size and quality. So you partition your data based off of geography before you feed it into your... Correct, correct. So map was made in, I think, 7 pieces and then mosaic together. That was just a project decision. It doesn't have to be done that way,
It's just what we did.
Yeah, does that give you, have you compared that to like other ways of partitioning your data?
We have not.
When you started the project, you said it was a NASA project?
Correct. Yeah.
Did NASA already have the resolution, the cameras ready to go, or did they have to do special things on the satellites to get a resolution improvement going?
No, these satellites are in orbit. They've been flying since 1984.
So the data has always been there. They
That's
just
right.
didn't have anybody willing to chop it up into such small pieces. I mean, what's the key to your project, cutting it down to 30?
No, data was always 30 meters. The problem was the volumes of data. We never had the computing sort of availability or the type of sort of training data and then team to bring it all together to make a map product like that.
So has that data, original data, been saved? Can you actually go back 30 years?
Absolutely. In fact, you can go back to 1972. Any place around the world, you can go back to 1970. Now, data quality is different as you go back, but any place around the world.
So you can see major agricultural changes in the last
You could.
60 years.
You could. That's right. That's our next project. Yeah. And data acquisition strategies have sort of are also different. So, for example, in the United States, every time there's a satellite overpass, the acquisition is made because there is a receiving station that receives downlinks that data and then puts it on an archive. Same is not true everywhere. So there are places around the planet where you will actually see some gaps because there are no sort of receiving capabilities, if you will.
And the satellite cannot store very much.
That's right. There's only so many minutes of storing, and that changes over time, obviously.
And is the satellite only giving you color information, just the color of a photograph?
We call it, we like to call it reflectance. So, for example, this carpet has reflectance in red color a certain quantity, 32%, for example. In infrared, it might be 17%. So for every place around the world, we have the reflectance quantity as sort of recorded as a digital number, digital quantity. And then we simply convert those digital quantities into map products. Yeah.
And can they see with this data how they're expanding into the jungles or using up land in this forest?
Absolutely. In fact, when you hear the numbers like, Amazon is losing so much forest every day, that data comes nothing but from satellites. Yeah, because that's the kind of information that is sort of really lends itself nicely to satellite data because we can detect those kind of changes very easily. Because what's forest and what's not forest is very obvious to people and to computers as well. There was somebody else. Yeah.
Who are the main users of this data? Can you give a couple examples?
So many of the sort of environmental organizations, so World Resources Organization, NGOs, variety of NGOs, U.S. Department of Agriculture, USAID, they've always had brought presence to our annual meetings or project meetings because they were very interested in a product like this.
Can you say a little bit about the scope of your study? Because there are things that are grown that are people food, and then there's animal food, and then there's things that aren't food at all.
Right.
So what are you covering? And how do you tell the difference between corn that's grown for animal feed versus corn that's grown for people?
So I'll start with the last part. So corn for silage, the animal feed, is a short-term corn, right? It has a shorter growing cycle, and it's harvested wet. That is, you don't let it dry until October. So if I have the satellite data observing a piece of agricultural land that I know it's corn, and all of a sudden that corn disappears in late August, I know that it's a silage corn because it got harvested earlier. So it's just sort of a small example.
Okay.
So now that's not always possible everywhere, but if we have enough information, you can sort of piece it together and map those. So the agriculture dominance product, the crop type product, is exactly getting at the type of questions you're interested in. So for example, there might be crops that are only used for animal feed, or only used for human feed, or for oils, like canola, for example. So if you know areas that are canola dominated, We know that they're more sort of oil, whether human consumption or not, oil products.
What about things like cotton? Would cotton be covered?
Sure. Yeah, we're covering 8 major commodities: wheat, corn, maize, soybean, cotton, chickpeas, rice. 2 more, I can't remember. It'll come to me. Yeah.
Hopefully barley.
I think barley's in there, yeah. Oh, I see.
Oh, one more.
Yeah.
We're done, that's all right.
Okay. Wow, I almost forgot the question was going to be now after hearing the barley.
Brain, where is
Yeah, it just kind of struck me a little strange. Did you mention that this data is accessible online?
Yes.
And where would that be located?
Croplands.org. Yeah. You can also download it from U.S. Geological Survey website, the actual high-resolution data set. Yeah, one of the rules of NASA funding is that all the research products have to be public. So, we made these products for public consumption.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.